Thymesia is an indie Souls-like where you can dash like Bloodborne and parry like Sekiro. It's also kind of easy and pretty short. My first run through clocked in around 8 hours, and that's completing every level and mission. Within that short time, there are moments when the combat really clicks, and you find yourself getting into an engaging and rewarding rhythm. But there's also a lot of asset reuse of levels and enemies. This definitely leads to issue given the game's brevity. With not too much time between the start of the game and the final boss, you'd want as much of that brief experience to be packed with unique encounters and enemies. Thymesia suffers in this regard. There is some really great gameplay to be had, but those moments sometimes feel too few and far between. The drawbacks notwithstanding, Thymesia clearly shows its mechanical skeleton to be that of the Souls-like genre, and it can deliver the high of thrilling combat that the Souls games are known for. With more development, Thymesia could have been a standout if smaller Souls-like experience, but for now, its shortcomings rival or outnumber its successes. In this video, I'll delve into the fruits and failures of this plague-themed action RPG, looking at how it utilizes the subgenre's formula. First, we'll see a broad overview of the overall design of Thymesia, and how its success is linked with its faults. To put it briefly, the core combat has been well refined, but most other stuff hasn't. Then we'll go a bit into detail about each aspect of the game. I'll avoid most spoilers till the later part of the video, and I'll say when they come up. Though I'll show some footage of the first bosses along with some of each main area in the game. If you find yourself enjoying the video, consider subscribing, as it helps the channel out. And with that, let's get into Thymesia, a critical review. In Thymesia, you play as Corvus, a crow-human hybrid who looks like a plague doctor, which is fitting because the game's setting, the Kingdom of Hermes, is beset by a devastating plague. Along with the plague killing and mutating people, there is also a presence of alchemical research, focusing largely on two kinds of blood, pure and vile, which is used in experiments and to strengthen the player character. Corvus himself is a result of this alchemical experimentation. Playing as the Crowman is fun. Your combat kit from dodge to slash to parry to claw to feather makes for a dynamic toolset which keeps fights high-paced. The player generally always has something to do, and they can choose which avenue they want to go down, playing more passive and dodging, playing more aggressive and parrying, or something in between. The combat can really soar, and I'll talk more about that when I get into the details of how it all works. For now, I'll leave it with those positive words to talk about the issues of the game, which is almost everything else. To start, there are only 3 main levels. Instead of an open or connected world, Thymesia gives instance levels in which you have to carry out missions. When you complete a level's main mission, you unlock the next level along with a few optional missions. Sometimes there are even more optional missions that open up after completing preliminary ones. All in all, there are 3 main levels along with one final level, which is essentially just the final boss fight. In the 3 levels, there are 12 missions in total, with 3 core missions and 9 optional ones. Just playing the core missions, which include 3 bosses plus the final boss, I finished a quick run through of the game in less than 1 hour. With the initial playthrough at less than 10 hours, this should show you how short of a game Thymesia is. This level formula works as a way to increase the content in the game without drastically increasing the development work, and that makes sense for the small development team. However, the game is already short, so replaying levels definitely takes a bit out of the experience. To be fair, a lot of them do situate you differently, so you progress in different ways, or explore parts of the level that aren't present in the rest of the other missions. There are even 1 or 2 missions that do have their complete own zone, like their own level or mini-level. So the implementation isn't terrible, but it is still a bit lackluster and kind of monotonous. There's also no New Game Plus at the moment, so what you have here is the entirety of what you get. You are able to go back and replay all the boss fights, which is a definite plus, and the game even pushes you to do so to get certain upgrades, so you get to feel your progression as you get more familiar with the game, which it shows each time you face the boss. There's an achievement to beat a boss without healing, and I eventually went back and got that on the first proper boss of the game, which is one of the more difficult ones, and that felt quite satisfying to do given my original high death count to him. Along with the level reuse, the enemy variety is also not stellar. You'll find similar knight enemies and the same kind of dude with sword for most of the game. As you progress, you do come across knights with special weapon types, which make for different gameplay, but it's not quite enough to keep things new. Occasionally, there is a more unique foe, like the whip enemy for instance, and these are a breath of fresh air that the game could have used a good amount more of. These issues, along with others like no voice acting, bosses being a little bit too easy, and a slight disconnect between the lore and the realization of it in enemies, all detract from the game. Thymesia could have achieved a comprehensive Souls effect even if on a smaller scale, but the lack of developed content across multiple areas of the game prevents this. I enjoy the story and lore concepts, especially in the pure blood, vile blood dichotomy that comes up throughout, and the plagued world building, but the enemies just don't deliver enough on these elements. The atmosphere and environment do a pretty good job, but with only 3 core levels, it just doesn't feel like there is enough here. As a preliminary general conclusion, Thymesia has some solid highs, but it needs more development and more distinct enemies. You can see potential in it, and I think this studio has potential too, especially in their ability to get the player into a satisfying flow state. Though as the game is now, the issues are unavoidable in any complete evaluation. It still has its fun and engaging moments, it just needs more of them. Now that I've gone over the game generally, let's dive into the details. First, we'll be expanding on my favorite part of the game, the combat. Thymesia gives the player 5 main tools for combat: dodge, parry, attack, special attack or claw, and feather. As I've already said, the dodge is a bit like Bloodborne's, fast and short, and the parry is a bit like Sekiro's, quick and a big part of taking down enemies. In this game, you don't have any stamina and enemies don't have a posture bar, but they do have something like it. When you parry enemies with your dagger or attack them with your sword, a white health bar will deplete to reveal a second green health bar. This is the wound bar, and it must be depleted to kill an enemy. You can whittle this down with basic sword attacks, but it's pretty slow going. Instead, the game supplies you with a special claw attack designed to delete these wounds. Altogether, these 4 options, plus the feather, which I'll come back to, are what you use to take down enemies. Dodge and parry their attacks while landing hits of your own, and then lock in your damage with your claw. With the quickness of the parry, you can often deflect attacks almost simultaneously with your claw swings. Getting into the rhythm with a boss can be pretty addicting. This core combat is modified by the game's leveling system, which takes a more streamlined approach compared to the dozen or so stats available for upgrade in Souls games. Instead, there are just 3 stats to choose from: Strength, Vitality, and Plague. Upgrading Strength increases your sword's attack power, upgrading Vitality gives you more health, and upgrading Plague gives you more energy and makes your claw do more damage to wounds. Each time you gain a level here, you get 1 skill point to invest in your various skill trees. These can be changed at any time, so you are free to experiment with them. And they range in kind from increasing your damage or feather count to giving you new abilities, counters, and buffs. To return to energy and feathers, energy is what you expend when using plague weapons, which are basically special kinds of attacks that you can unlock and upgrade by defeating enemies who use the same weapons. A bow enemy can drop materials which let you unlock the bow plague weapon, a spear enemy the spear plague weapon, and so on. These plague weapons have cooldowns and energy costs, but you can get energy back through the use of your claw and potions. Feathers are projectiles which slowly regenerate after use, and they are first introduced to let you counter enemy special attacks. One of their skill upgrades gives you a dash to close distance between you and your enemy, and this was the main reason I used them in my playthrough. Eventually, you can unlock perks which let you basically Makiri counter the special attacks, or just parry them, and I ended up relying on these methods instead of the feathers. So those are the core gameplay mechanics. There are also health charges in the form of potions, and you can unlock 3 different kinds. You start with normal, and you can get slow ones which heal over time, or fast ones which heal instantly and can be used quicker. I'm a fan of the fast ones as they feel like blood vials, and they can help keep up the pace during fights. You can upgrade these potions with materials from killing strong enemies, and you can use ingredients to give them special effects, like increased damage or resistance. Now you'll understand most of what happens on the screen. This system feels the most fleshed out of anything in the game to me. It makes sense that the combat is the central focus, and I think Overborder Studio, the dev team, did a good job with their own implementation of this kind of action RPG. There can occasionally be some issues with getting locked into punish chains from enemies, even if you input correctly on a second or third hit if you get hit on the first hit, but overall the kit they give the player is pretty comprehensive and satisfying to use once you get your bearings. Learning enemy movesets and becoming comfortable enough to dodge into and parry enemy attacks while keeping up your own slashes and claws makes for a satisfying and engaging combat flow. You have to decide your openings to attack in, but parries can come out blisteringly fast when you're using your claw. Claw, claw, parry, claw becomes your punish dance, and it feels great when you get it working, especially against someone like Varg. Really, the only issue here, other than the aforementioned stickiness of some enemy punishes, is that when you get into the flow and comfortable with a boss, they often get too easy. I think some more mix-ups or even letting bosses occasionally parry the player would help. Or if bosses had some kind of claw counter, it would help keep things more engaging and increase the skill ceiling. While there are definitely elements and enemies in the game that are challenging when you're learning them, the switch sometimes flips too quickly from difficult to sailing through the enemy with ease. Overall though, the combat is pretty great and it's what kept me hooked into the game. Unfortunately, most of the game is not up to par with this system, and this detracts from the heights that it could have reached. The bosses are generally not very hard, some of them I beat on my first try, and the first boss might be one of the toughest, especially given that you meet it early on in your playthrough. Another boss, the tutorial knight Varg, who is destined to kill you at the game's start, even if you get the achievement for taking out his first health bar, shares either some or all of his kit with another normal enemy, the generic heavy sword knight. Given that there are only 7 or 8 bosses in the game, it's disappointing to see asset reuse here too. As I noted before, the enemy design is also overall disappointing. The knights take on different visual effects in the different levels, but these don't seem to impact gameplay at all. They just give the enemies different death animations, which is cool, but I'd rather have a gameplay change. The levels are demarcated by having some different enemies in them, in that the later levels introduce enemies like the bow knight or the twin sword knight, but when these are the same knights, just with a new weapon which is almost always melee, it doesn't feel like much variation. This is especially true because the parry turns most of the fights into a rhythm game, so giving a basic knight a different attack rhythm would have been almost indistinguishable from these new enemies. The few times where an enemy is a different thing than just a knight, like with the whip enemy or the bloodsword enemy, things do liven up. Some projectiles and other mechanics change up the pace, but the game could have used a lot more of these. I've already discussed the level reuse to the point that I can't add anything too meaningful here, it just takes away from the game since it's already so short. Plus, the environments of the first 2 levels are both pretty dark and damp. They do have different architecture, which is good, but when you only have 3 levels, they should each clearly exemplify different thematic notes for the player to feel difference in them. The similar dankness between levels 1 and 2 did not really achieve that for me. I will say that I like the lore of the game, it impacts which ending you get, and it is dependent on you completing each mission and searching out an NPC to get answers. It adds to the world building and reveals a deeper story to most of the game's major players. There are conspiracies and secret research projects of injecting pure and vile blood into soldiers and animals. It fits and adds to the plague elements. Though the lack of different enemies to flesh out the lore hurts. For example, in the note to the last level, it says that there are 2 kinds of knights in the kingdom's fortress, the Knights of the Pure Blood and the Royal Guard. These 2 groups came up as distinct in the lore and they serve different purposes. But none of the game's basic enemies or knights bear any distinction, so when I fought through the fortress, I never experienced fighting one group and then the other. There was no difference in the enemies, at least that I could see, and that meant the interesting lore didn't get to complement the gameplay like it could have. It didn't change the feeling of killing the 3rd bowman or the 15th knight with a sword and shield. Lastly, I want to talk about the final boss. So spoiler warning, if you don't want to spoil yourself, then go to this time in the video. Okay, so the final boss of the game is a mimic fight. You fight yourself, Corvus, and he is equipped with the kit that you have been amassing throughout the game. I don't think the boss's moveset is actually dependent on what you unlock or use, but chances are you will unlock almost everything if you play through all of the game's missions. The fight is interesting because you get to put to the test everything you've learned, both in offense and defense. But it's also lackluster because we don't get anything new for the final boss of the game. It's just a rehash of a bunch of moves that we are already familiar with. There are lots of combat tools to engage with, such as the parry and claw, so it makes for a better one-on-one than say Elden Ring's mimic boss fight. But it pales in comparison to something like Ishin in Sekiro, where we get that kind of duel between equals but still have a wide variety of new moves and attacks that add to the fight's engagement factor and its spectacle. Maybe it would have been better to have Corvus be a Phase 1 and then grow to something more unique in Phase 2, like turn more crow than human, undergo a dark, sinister transformation. That could fit with the corrupting and empowering blood motifs that are present in the lore, and we do see something similar to that with one of the earlier bosses, it's just that the game separates it into 2 different fights. The game could in general have more amped up Phase 2s for bosses. That would help with the difficulty, and this fight especially could use the buff to make it something a lot more distinct and memorable. It could even have been a better fight if boss Corvus could use parry, so you can't just spam attack at him during any opening. Having a little bit of this would keep the player a bit more on edge, and it would feel better and more natural since we have a parry and we're supposed to be fighting ourselves, but Boss Corvus never parries us. Overall, Thymesia shines during some of the boss fights, but the lack of development in most other areas, especially enemy variety, holds it back. I had fun with the game, I enjoyed a bit of the exploration and the fights, but I didn't get much more of a cohesive experience other than those few moments where the dance of combat really clicked. And one final note I forgot to mention earlier, the soundtrack to the game is fine. The main theme is fitting and grandiose in the right way, but most of the others are somewhat forgettable to me. I will say that the OST to the first level did have an adequately fun yet kind of creepy investigative vibe, so the main theme and level 1 OST are solid, the rest were so-so. And that concludes most of what I have to say about Thymesia in terms of a critical review. It has its positives, but the lack of development shows in a lot of areas. I may do 1 or 2 more videos on the game, such as an endings guide and explanation, or maybe something about the lore or bosses, so if you like this video, want to see that content, or want to see more of my usual Elden Ring content, feel free to subscribe to the channel or become a patron on Patreon. Both really help the channel out and let me dedicate more time and effort into making these videos. With that, thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.